Silas was hunting deer when he stumbled upon the camp. 5 orcs tied up and barefoot in the cold. 5 drunk mercenaries laughing around the fire. He could have walked away, but something told him to set them free. The night was on his side. The cold was on his side. The mercenaries were too drunk. He just needed to wait a little longer. And years hunting in the northern marks had taught him one thing. The man who acts first in the dark is rarely the one who falls. The forest had a smell Silas recognized. Wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp bite of wood smoke coming from somewhere too close to be accidental. He stopped walking, lowered the bow, listened. Voices, rough and loose, men who had been drinking for hours. He moved without sound between the trees, following the light of the fire through the dark gaps in the branches. When he crouched behind the last line of brush and saw what was in the clearing, he stayed very still for a long moment. 5 orcs tied to a thick oak tree, their wrists wrapped in iron chains that bit into green skin. They had no boots. The ground under their feet was frozen. Their clothes, leather and hide, the kind worn by mountain clans, were torn in the places that showed they had not come willingly. 5 mercenaries sat around the fire, passing a bottle. Big men, armed, laughing at something that had nothing to do with the women chained behind them. Silas counted the distance, counted the men, counted the shadows between him and the fire. He could have walked away. He had done it before, or so he told himself, but somewhere under the cold logic of the calculation, something older and harder pushed back. He had spent 3 years alone on the ridge, above the Tescan River, learning to ignore that voice. It turned out 3 years was not long enough. He waited. The bottle made 2 more rounds. One of the men fell asleep against a log. Another stumbled to the tree line to relieve himself, and did not come back quickly. Silas set the bow down. This was not bull work. He pulled the short blade from his belt and moved into the clearing from the north, where the fire threw the worst shadows. The first man did not hear a thing. He simply went from sitting to lying down with no clear moment in between. The second one turned too fast and tripped over his own bench. The 3 who remained were sharper, veterans by the way they stood up, but they were cold and drunk, and Silas was neither. When the confusion settled, 2 men lay unconscious in the snow. One had a broken nose pressed against a root. 2 others had disappeared down the south trail toward Goldport without looking back. The 5th, the leader by the ring of keys and leather pouches at his belt, was flat on his back, with Silas's knee on his chest and a knife at his throat. "Who were you taking them to?" The man spat blood. "Captain Vagger, Post of Marek, you just bought yourself a war, blacksmith." Silas took the keys, stood up and left the man in the snow. He walked to the oak. The 5 orcs watched him in complete silence. No visible fear, no performed gratitude, only that flat, careful look he recognized from his years negotiating between clans and fortresses. Who is this man, and what will he want in return? He opened the shackles one by one without saying a word. The last one to stand was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a horizontal scar crossing the left side of her jaw. She rubbed her wrists slowly, looked at the mercenaries on the ground, looked at Silas. "Why?" she said. "Just that." Silas picked his bow up from the snow and set it on his shoulder. "My forge is half an hour up the river. There's fire, there's stew, there's dry floor." He paused. "You can come or stay here, but those 2 will wake up soon." He turned and started walking. He counted his steps. 6, 7, 8. Then he heard the snow give under 5 pairs of feet behind him. The forge smelled like burned wood, tanned leather, and cold iron. Silas heated the turnip and wild boar stew left from lunch and served it in tin bowls without ceremony. They ate. Nobody spoke. When the bowls were empty, the one who had spoken in the forest stood and began washing her bowl in the water bucket near the stove. The others followed, without anyone needing to say anything. Silas watched that. It was not the gesture of someone who had been served. It was the gesture of someone who knew nothing came free and preferred to pay before being asked. He respected that. Later, When the others slept, rolled in the wool blankets he had pulled from the chest, hard floor, but warmer than snow, the leader sat by the stove and stared into the coals. Silas sat on the other side. He did not ask. He waited. "My name is Thraka," she said at last. "The others are Moksha, Zarya, Madra, and Biska." A pause. "We came from the Iron Peaks." Silas knew the Iron Peaks. He had negotiated safe passage through those mountains twice during his years at the Iron Borders. He knew what that meant. A strong clan, closed territory, orcs who did not come down to the valley unless they had a serious reason. What were 5 orcs from the Iron Peaks doing chained to an oak in Thornwood? Thraka turned the empty bowl in her hands for a moment. "Our war chief signed a deal with Captain Vaga 2 months ago, enough silver to arm the whole clan for a winter." Her voice was flat as stone. "In exchange, Vaga could recruit orcs for forced labor in Lord Drakmar's mines. Volunteers first, then not so voluntary. You refused." "We saw what happened to the ones who went first." Her yellow eyes met his. "They didn't come back." Silas was quiet for a moment. "So your own clan handed you to Vaga?" "We're a problem," Thraka said simply. "We know too much. And 5 clanless orcs are worth more as bargaining chips than as witnesses." Silas looked at the fire. He knew that calculation. He had been paid to make that calculation once, years ago, when a lord at the Iron Borders had asked him to draft an agreement that sounded like peace, but smelled like a delivery. He had refused. He had been dismissed. He had built this forge. "Vaga will send more men," he said. "Yes," Thraka answered, "and you have nowhere to go." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silas stood, went to the stove and added a log. The fire gained color. "Then you stay, until we think of something better." Thraka watched him for a long moment. There was something in her look he couldn't name. It was not gratitude, not trust, not yet. It was something closer to cautious wonder, like someone extending a hand toward an animal that had always bitten before. "Why do you keep doing this?" she said. "First the forest, now this." Silas stood with his back to her for a moment. "Because I did the opposite once," he said. "I didn't like how it felt." The days that followed had a rhythm Silas had not felt in years. Not since the Iron Borders, where there was always someone arriving, always something to settle, always noise filling the gaps. The forge had been silent for so long that the first morning he woke to the sound of someone moving quietly near the fire, he reached for the knife on the shelf before he was fully awake. Then he heard the stove creak open, smelled wood smoke, remembered. Moksha had started the fire before he rose. She did it every morning after that, without being asked, without comment, as if it was simply the natural order of things. Zarya found the leak in the side wall of the barn on the 2nd day. She did not say anything about it. Silas came out in the afternoon and found her on the roof with a bundle of pine resin and cut bark, sealing the gap with the careful focus of someone who had done that kind of work many times before. Madra cleaned the tools. Biska, the quietest of the 5, a young woman with careful eyes who seemed to be cataloguing everything she looked at, dismantled the rusted latch on the supply room door and reassembled it so it actually turned. Thraka worked the ground near the fence. The soil there was hard, half frozen, more stone than earth. Silas had left it fallow since he built the place. Telling himself there was no point planting alone, he watched her drive a short iron bar into the ground again and again to break the crust, working in long, clean lines, and felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. On the 3rd evening, she came in and set a small cloth bag on the table. "Barley seeds," she said. "I had them in my coat pocket when they took us." She kept half of them back in the bag. The rest she pressed into the broken ground near the fence, one by one, with her thumb. He looked at the bag, then at her. "You kept seeds in your pocket." A woman from the Iron Peaks doesn't walk anywhere without seeds in her pocket. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It was my mother's rule. Silas looked at the bag for another moment. Then he pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. "Tell me about the Iron Peaks," he said. She sat, and she talked. Not the careful, measured words she had used the first night. These were different. Slower in some places, faster in others. The way people speak when they are not managing what they say, but simply saying it. She told him about the clans and the mountain winters, about the rituals of the bone totems and the way the shamans rid smoke for signs of coming storms. About her mother, who had been a healer, and her older brother, who'd been the best tracker in 3 generations of their line. About the morning the war chief called the council and announced the agreement with Vaga, and the cold that had moved through her when she understood what kind of agreement it really was. She did not cry. Silas had not expected her to, but at one point she stopped talking mid-sentence, looked at the fire for a long moment, and then continued with a slightly different voice, the voice of someone who had pressed a weight back down and was choosing to keep it there for now. Silas did not fill the silence when it came. He had learned that from the borders. Some silences were not gaps to be covered. Some were part of what was being said. Later, when the fire had burned low and the others were sleeping, Thraka asked him a question he had not expected. "What did you lose," she said, "when you left the borders?" He was quiet for a while. "A version of myself I had been building for 10 years, he said. The one that believed words written on paper could hold against men with enough silver." She nodded slowly, not as if she understood in theory, as if she understood exactly. On the 4th morning, Silas woke before dawn and went out to check the perimeter. He did this every day. Old habit from the borders. Walk the edge of whatever space you were responsible for. Note what had changed, note what had not. Most mornings it was uneventful. Rabbit tracks, a branch down from the wind. Once, a fox circling the chicken pen with professional patience. That morning the snow had new prints in it. Not animals, boot prints, 2 sets coming from the south trail, stopping at the edge of the tree line, turning back. They had come in the night, they had looked, they had left. Silas stood over the prints for a long time. The cold bit through his coat. He did not feel it. He went back inside and said nothing at breakfast. But after the plates were cleared, he sat Thraka down at the table and laid it out plainly. "They scouted last night," he said. 2 men. They didn't come closer than the tree line, which means they were counting, not attacking. Vaga is building a picture of what he's dealing with." Thraka looked at him steadily. "When will he move?" "If I were him, 1 more day of watching. Then come in force." He paused. 8 men minimum, maybe more." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We can fight." "Yes," Silas said. "But that's not the only question." She looked at him. "The question is whether fighting here is winning or just surviving long enough for the next group to come." He leaned back in the chair. "Vaga has a contract and a patron. We win this fight. He gets more men. We win that fight, Lord Drakmar sends soldiers. There is no version of this story where we win by staying and fighting." Thraka put both hands flat on the table. It was a gesture he was starting to recognize, the way she steadied herself before saying something she had already worked out but did not want to say. "You're telling me we have to run." "I'm telling you that staying means fighting forever," he said, "and I've done that. I know how it ends." She looked at the table, at the barley seeds she had pressed into the ground 3 days ago near the fence. At the wall Zarya had sealed. At the door latch Biska had fixed so it actually turned. Silas saw her looking at those things. He understood what it cost to look at them the way she was looking. "There's something I need to show you," he said, "but not yet. Tonight, after we prepare." He spent the rest of the day in quiet logistics. He sharpened both knives and the hunting blade. He checked the rifles, the newer one he kept above the fireplace, the older one he had carried from the iron borders and never thrown away. He moved the supply bags to near the door. Thraka spent the day saying nothing to the others about the prince, but Silas watched them through the afternoon and saw that they were ready anyway, in the way mountain people are ready, not anxious, just quietly different. Moksha sharpened her own knife without being told. Biska moved the carved bone chime from the window and wrapped it carefully in cloth and set it near the door. Zaria and Madra spoke to each other in low voices and then stopped speaking and were simply present. That night, Silas explained the plan he was beginning to form. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. And then he told them what to do if 8 men came through the gate the next morning. Vaga sent 8 men on the morning of the 5th day. Silas saw them coming over the ridge before they reached sight of the forge. He came down calmly, knocked 3 times on the wall with the handle of his axe, the code they had agreed on the night before. When the 8 arrived at the gate, Silas was on the threshold, rifle resting on his shoulder. The expression of a man who had been expecting company. The leader, broad leather hat, an old scar running down his chin, did not even reach the gate. He stopped in the middle of the clearing and pointed his finger. "You are the man who attacked a legal operation of Captain Vaga in Thornwood Forest and freed 5 orcs under forced labor contract." It was not a question. "Contract signed by the war chief of the Iron Peaks," the man continued, "which makes those orcs confiscated property, which makes you a thief, a saboteur, and an accessory to escape." A calculated pause. "Where are they?" Silas did not answer immediately. He let the silence work. The 8 men were spread in a semicircle, 2 flanking left toward the barn, 2 on the right. 4 in the center with the leader, a siege formation, people who had done this before. "You're on my property," Silas said, "registered at the post of Marek. Everything under this roof is under legal protection." The leader gave a short laugh. "Legal protection doesn't cover stolen property, blacksmith." And he gestured for the 2 on the left flank to advance toward the barn. That was when the forge roof became relevant. Thraka had been lying flat on the tiles since before the men arrived. She had no bow. She had Silas's second rifle, the older one, the one he had carried from the iron borders and never thrown away. The shot did not hit anyone. It was not meant to. The bullet struck the snow exactly between the feet of the 2 advancing men. They stopped as if the ground had vanished. Absolute silence in the clearing. The leader looked at the roof, looked at Silas, made the calculation. "You have 2 shots," said the leader. "We are 8. 2 visible shots," Silas corrected. The side door opened slowly. Moksha came out with the wood-splitting axe in her right hand and an expression of complete emptiness on her face. Zaria came out behind her with a butcher's knife. Madra stood in the doorway with a heated iron bar pulled from the forge. Biska did not appear, which meant she was somewhere nobody could see, and that was worse. The leader swept the clearing with his eyes, counted, calculated. 2 men standing frozen on the left flank without advancing, 2 on the right looking sideways instead of forward. Thraka on the roof with the rifle aimed at his chest. Silas on the threshold with his own rifle still not aimed at anyone, which was almost more intimidating than if it had been. It was the man on the right flank who stepped back first, then the second, and when 2 retreat the formation is broken. The leader stayed still for 1 more moment. "This won't stay like this," he said, his voice cold, without anger, which was more dangerous than anger. Anger makes mistakes, cold makes plans. "Vaga will come back with enough men to burn this forge to the ground, and nobody at the post of Marek will ask why." Silas did not answer. The leader spat on the ground, turned. The 8 left down the south trail, slowly, in the calculated way of people retreating by choice. People like that come back. Silas knew it. When the trail was empty, Thraka came down from the roof and stood beside Silas. The 2 looked at the boot marks in the snow pointing away from the forge. "He wasn't bluffing," she said. "No," Silas agreed. Silence for a moment. The wind cut through the clearing. "So what do we do?" Thraka asked. Silas was quiet for a while. He looked at the forge he had built with his own hands 6 years ago. At the roof, Moksha had repaired. At the barn, rebuilt by Zarya and Madra. At the groove of barley Thraka had pressed into the hard earth near the fence. Then he looked at her. He turned without another word and went inside. After a moment, Thraka followed. Silas went to the chest under the bed and pulled out a document folded in four, yellowed at the edges, with the seal of a Goldport notary. He opened it on the table. It was a deed. Land in the valley beyond the northern marks. 2 weeks of travel to the west, far from Vagga's roots, far from the iron borders, far from any lord who knew the name of Silas Grenvok. He had bought it 3 years ago with everything he had saved from his military service. He had planned to go alone when he became too old to keep the forge. 40 acres, he said, a clean river, good land for barley and root crops, enough forest for firewood for 2 lifetimes. Thraka looked at the paper, then at him. "You bought this for yourself," she said. "I bought it to leave when I had nothing left here," he answered, "but now I do." The others had come to the table without anyone calling them. Moksha looked at the ink map drawn in the margin of the deed. Biska ran her finger along the river line. Zarya and Madra exchanged a look that Silas could not read, but that clearly meant something. "Vagga doesn't know this place exists," Silas continued. "Nobody knows. There's no name of mine tied to any route that leads there. Once we arrive, we are new people on new land." "And this forge?" Thraka asked. "It stays for whoever comes after." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that Silas took time to name. It was not debt, not gratitude. It was the expression of someone who had stopped waiting for the floor to collapse and was beginning, carefully, to trust the weight of her own feet. "When do we leave?" she said. "Now," Silas answered. "Before they come back with more men." There was no argument. No hesitation. In 2 hours the cart was loaded with what mattered. Flour, salt, tools, leather, the 2 rifles, seeds that Thraka had kept in the canvas bag since the first week. Moksha took the herbs drying above the stove. Biska dismantled the carved bone and tin chime from the window and wrapped it carefully in cloth. Zarya led Silas's 2 horses from the stable and tied them to the cart without needing to be asked. Silas stood on the threshold for a moment. He looked at the forge, the repaired roof, the walls he had raised stone by stone, the stove that had warmed more people than he had planned for. Thraka came to stand beside him. She said nothing. She just leaned her shoulder against his for 1 second. He closed the door. He did not lock it. There was no reason. They left before midday by the north trail that skirted the Tescan River and climbed beyond the northern marks. The snow still covered the ground, but the sky was open, blue and cold and cloudless. The horses moved slowly under the weight of the cart, but steadily, without stopping. Silas drove. Thraka sat beside him on the front bench, her coat closed to the chin, her yellow eyes on the horizon. Behind them, Moksha and Biska slept leaning on each other, wrapped in wool blankets. Zarya and Madra talked quietly, in a language Silas understood in parts, but had never fully learned. The first 2 days were easy. The trail was familiar, the trees dense enough to block the worst of the wind, the river close enough to hear through the night. They made fire in the hollow of a fallen oak on the first evening, and ate dried meat and hard bread, and nothing about it felt like deprivation. On the 3rd day the trail narrowed and began to climb. The horses worked harder. The cart creaked on slopes that had more ice than earth. They tied ropes to the wheels to keep it from sliding on the steepest sections, and walked beside it instead of riding, which was slower but safer. That afternoon Biska came up beside Silas as they walked, and matched his pace without speaking for a while. She walked beside him in silence before speaking. "There's something following us," she said. "Since this morning." Silas did not look back. "One rider or more than one?" "I can't tell. I only hear it when the wind drops." She paused. "It stays far back, far enough that it could be nothing, but it doesn't feel like nothing." "No," Silas agreed. "It doesn't." He said nothing more that night, but he slept in 2-hour intervals and listened between them. The fourth night was the same. Something was back there, patient, consistent, neither closing the gap nor falling behind. On the fifth morning he told Thraka. She listened without changing expression. Then she said, "One of Vaga's men." "Possibly. Or someone from the post of Marek, who noticed the cart leaving north and got curious." He paused. "Or the war chief sent someone." Thraka looked at the trail behind them. The trees had thinned here. If anyone was back there, they had less cover than before. "If it's the war chief," she said, "they're not here to help." "I know." She thought for a moment. "We can't outrun a single rider." "No," Silas said, "but we don't have to." He explained what he had in mind. It was simple. Simple plans work better than complicated ones in the cold, where fingers were slow and judgment was tired. Thraka listened, asked 2 questions, and nodded once. That evening they made camp early, in a spot where the trail bent around a rock outcrop and the sight line behind them was long. Biska climbed the rock. Silas built the fire larger than necessary. They waited. The rider appeared just before dark, a single figure on a brown horse, stopping when he saw the fire. Far enough away that his features were shadow, close enough to see that he carried no weapons raised. Then Silas recognized the shape of the coat, and something inside him went very still. The rider did not move for a long time. Silas stood at the edge of the firelight and waited. Then the figure dismounted, left the horse, walked forward on foot with his hands open and visible at his sides, the gesture of someone who understood exactly how this looked and was choosing to be readable. When he came close enough for the fire to reach his face, Silas let out a slow breath. The man was young, younger than he had looked from a distance. Orc by the height and the green of his skin, the pointed ears, the long dark hair pulled back with a strip of hide. He wore a travelling coat too large for him, caked with trail mud on the lower half. He was not armed with anything Silas could see. He looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who had been riding hard for 5 days on an idea and was only now, standing in front of actual people, wondering if the idea had been sound. "I'm not from Vaga," the young man said. His voice was carefully controlled. "And I'm not from the war chief." "Then who sent you?" Silas said. "Nobody." He paused. "I followed you because I was already watching the forge. I heard in Goldport that a blacksmith on the Tescan Ridge had taken 5 orcs from Vaga's men. It wasn't hard to guess who they were." He paused. "I saw you leave at midday, and I recognized Thraka." Thraka had stepped forward beside Silas. Her expression was unreadable for a moment. Then something shifted in it. "Davin," she said. The young man's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, but in the specific release of someone who had not been sure they would be recognized. "You remember me. You were 11 the last time I saw you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Your mother was the healer in the southern quarter." "She still is." He glanced down briefly. "She doesn't know I'm here." Thraka looked at Silas. Something passed between them, quick and wordless, the kind of exchange that happens when 2 people have been making decisions together long enough that some of the conversation can happen without language. "Come sit," Silas said. Davan sat at the fire and accepted the tin cup of water Moksha held out without comment. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who knew their weight. After Thraka and the others had been taken, the mood in the Iron Peaks had changed. The war chief's justification that the 5 had been liabilities, that the deal with Vaga kept the clan safe, had held for about a week. Then the questions had started, small ones at first, then louder. Davin's mother had been the first to speak directly. She had stood in the council circle and said that a clan that traded its own members for silver was not a clan keeping itself safe. It was a clan selling itself piece by piece. The war chief had dismissed her. 2 days later, she had been removed from her position as healer. That was when Davan had left. "She told me if I found you to tell you, "The agreement with Vaga is breaking apart from the inside," he said. "3 other clans in the range have heard what happened. None of them will sign with him now. His access to the mountain routes is finished." He looked at Thraka. "And the war chief knows it. He's losing the council. He can't afford to have you exist and be free, but he also can't afford to make a move that turns the other clans against him entirely." Silence around the fire. "What does your mother want?" Thraka asked. Davin met her eyes. "She wants to know if there's still something worth coming back to." Thraka was quiet for a long time. She looked at the fire. She looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. It was not his answer to give. "Tell her," Thraka said at last, "that I don't know yet. But the question is the right one to be asking." Davan nodded. He slept a few hours near the fire and was gone before dawn, back the way he had come, riding the brown horse north into the still dark morning. They reached the new land on a clear morning, 2 weeks after leaving the forge. The valley opened below them from the top of a long slope, wider than Silas had expected, even having bought it, even having looked at the map 100 times. A river ran along the western edge, shallow and fast over pale stones. The forest came down from the north in a clean, dark line. The grass under the snow was visible at the southern end, where the angle of the slope kept the worst of the cold off the ground. Silas stopped the cart at the crest and looked at it for a long time. 40 acres, Thraka said beside him. Not a question, a kind of reckoning. 40 acres, he confirmed. They made camp at the river bend that first afternoon. Not a permanent camp, just enough to rest the horses and take the measure of the place. Biskar walked the length of the eastern edge and came back with a report on the soil. Zarya found the spot where the river widened into a natural pool that would hold well into summer. Madra climbed the nearest ridge and looked north for a long time, then came down and said the approach from that direction was clear and wide. Good sightlines, no easy cover for anyone coming uninvited. Moksha built the first fire on the new land. She did it the way she had done it every morning in the forge, quietly, without ceremony, as if continuing something that had simply moved location. That evening, Silas sat with Thraka at the edge of the firelight. "You gave up everything you built," Thraka said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the valley. "No," Silas said. She turned. He looked at the cart behind them, at the 5 women who had entered his forge as survivors and were leaving as something he still had no exact name for, but that was more solid than any wall he had ever raised. "I brought everything I built," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the valley, but she leaned her shoulder against his and did not move away. "He wasn't wrong," she said after a while. "Davan, about the question." Silas looked at the river. "The Iron Peaks aren't finished," she said. "The war chief will lose the council. When he does, there will be something left. And that something will need to decide what it is." "That's not now," Silas said. "No." She looked at the fire. "But it's not never either." They planted in the first month. Barley, from the seeds Thraka had kept in the canvas bag since the first week. Root crops, a small plot of winter herbs near the river where the soil held warmth longer. They built slowly with their hands. The first structure was a shelter for the horses, then a covered storage, then a proper roof over where they slept, raised from timber and river stone, sealed with clay and pine resin. Nothing quick, nothing that would need rebuilding in a year. Nobody came after them. Vaga never learned where they had gone. The war chief of the Iron Peaks had other problems, and then, by the following spring, had different problems still, political ones, which were harder to fight with silver. Lord Drakmar's mines ran into a different kind of trouble that had nothing to do with Silas Grenvok or 5 orcs from the mountains. The world is sometimes like that. Not just never entirely just, but sometimes for those who choose to disappear in the right direction, it is enough. In the autumn, when the barley came up full and gold in the morning light, Thraka stood at the edge of the field and stayed there for a long time without speaking. Silas came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. Neither did she. She leaned her shoulder against his. He did not move away. Somewhere to the north, beyond the clean, dark line of the forest, a new season was beginning. And somewhere further than that, in the high cold of the Iron Peaks, a young man was riding home to his mother with a message and a question that had no easy answer, but was, at least, finally being asked out loud. The lesson was not in the fight. It was not in facing down 8 men in a clearing or standing firm while a cold voice promised fire. It was in the cart that left before they came back, in the seeds kept in a coat pocket, in 40 acres bought by a solitary man for a solitary death, used instead for something that had no name yet but was growing, slowly, honestly, the way everything that lasts is grown. Sometimes the only victory possible is not defeating the enemy. It is simply not being there when he returns. And building, far away and slowly, something no Captain Vagger in the world will ever find. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-bound Legacy.